Aloha, I'm Beth Ann Kozlovich. Thank you for tuning in to GMO Week on Olelo. From a Hawaii perspective, it's essential to question the impact of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, on our environment, lands, resources, and the effects they have on our community and public policy. But let's face it, many of us don't know where to begin with such a complex issue. How do you separate real fact from emotional bias? That's what we hope to do this week in a series of programs to explore and explain some of the pros and cons of GMOs. If you visit olelo.org/GMO, you'll be able to watch these GMO discussions on demand, and you can tune in to a live GMO debate and even participate by tweeting your questions to #OleloGMO. The national conversation has moved on from just are you pro or anti-GMO to the right to know what's in the food we buy. Should any food made with GMOs be labeled? And what should the label specifically say so anyone can make an informed choice? This program is the second of 2 half-hour segments. I'll be talking with activists who are anti-GMO. First, a video presentation by our panelists.
Now, islands are very fragile, and yet the most lethal planting material has not just been imported here, but is being multiplied here by the biotech industry.
GMOs are the most destructive thing happening in Hawaii today.
And then I just was shocked that this was going on and I didn't even know about it.
Those poisons are going in your food. They're in the air you breathe, the water you drink every day. We need to stop those poisons.
We have no way of controlling those substances once they become a life of their own. And we cannot prevent them from essentially polluting the rest of the planet with their transgenic materials.
The GMO seed companies considerably expanded their acreage after the closure of plantation agriculture in the state. The state provided considerable tax incentives to these companies to expand acreage in Hawaii instead of considering alternative uses for these agricultural lands.
The whole world is being pressured into this business and this agribusiness.
The use of herbicides in these GMO trials in Hawaii is magnitudes greater than what's used in conventional agriculture.
They're spraying up to 22 or more restricted use pesticides.
The biotechnology companies often say that overall genetically engineered crops cut pesticide use. In fact, overall it increases pesticide use 115 million more pounds a year.
We detected in the air the smells, and a lot of our people are really getting sick.
There's a place called Waimea Canyon Middle School, and it's on the west side where a lot of these seed corn companies have their fields. And there was 3 different times when kids got sick. And a couple of times they went to the hospital in an ambulance. I mean, they're really sick, and the teachers too.
I'm really concerned about, the future, our kids and what they're going to be eating.
January 15, 2012, Ho'olehua was hit with a pretty bad dust storm coming from Monsanto's fields. Shortly after, our son, who was 6 months at that time, developed a really bad cough. And it was so bad that we had to take him to the emergency room. When I saw that our family was directly affected by living near these fields, I decided to get involved to research these companies and to find out what it was that they were doing on our island.
Monsanto has a tremendous influence over our state legislature, and that has been what's prevented any sort of regulation over the biotech companies here in Hawaii.
A lot of times our laws are designed to let anything go until the science proves it's a problem.
Being formerly the director of the Office of Environmental Quality Control, I dealt a lot with environmental impact statements. There's direct impacts. What happens when you spray this stuff day one? There's indirect impacts. What happens to things that you didn't mean to spray? And there's long-term secondary and cumulative impacts. So what happens after 20 years of spraying? What happens to the rivers, the streams? What happens to their children, that grow up day after day being exposed to this? But the studies of combining all these various pesticides haven't been done.
In recent ads, Monsanto says that these genetically engineered crops will feed the world. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, in 2009, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a report called Failure to Yield. Not one of these genetically engineered crops actually increases yield, not one. The vast majority of these crops are corn and soy. over 95% of all corn and soy is used for cars and to feed cattle. And that is not something that most poor people who are starving need.
In 2011, hundreds of Waimea residents stood up for themselves and filed suit to protect their town and community from dust and pesticides from DuPont Pioneer's GMO research operation in Waimea. But what this example of Waimea shows is that you cannot trust these companies with our health and our environment.
It's not about the money. The lawsuit isn't about whether we win or lose. It's about whether they stop poisoning our community or not.
In an island where we should have diversity and is a garden island, you are getting the worst of violent agriculture-like war.
Aloha, I'm Tulsi Gabbard, and I have the privilege and honor of representing Hawaii's 2nd District here in the United States Congress. The citizens of Hawaii do not currently have the ability to know if their food has been genetically engineered or not. This concerns me, and I think you should be concerned as well. I hope you'll join me, Senator Russ Ruderman, Representative Jessica Woolley, and Councilman Gary Hooser in supporting the labeling of genetically engineered foods. Mahalo.
We just saw another video similar to what happened the other night when we all got together. Thanks so much for coming back and being willing to continue the conversation. Last time when we were together, Gary, we got a snapshot of what's happening on Kauai with you, and with you, Walter, a snapshot of what's happening on Molokai. Scott, you talked about some of the macro issues that we need to look at. We talked about, do we really have the political will to advance this agenda of labeling? And we also talked about some of the information, Gary, that you've been trying to get from Monsanto and have been unable to, even though Monsanto is on state land. For a lot of people, the question is, how can that be?
Well, I asked myself the same thing. How can that be? Monsanto is not on Kauai. They used to be, but they've moved. And they're on other places. I think they're in Molokai and maybe here in Oahu. We have 4 other seed companies, GMO companies there, Pioneer, Syngenta, BASF, and Dow. And the 4 of them, you know, I met with them personally, just face to face, like we're sitting right here, several months ago, 6 months ago, and I asked them, I said, people are concerned and they want to know what you're spraying. They want to know if you're doing experimental pesticides. And during that conversation, they told me, relax, that we're not doing experimental pesticide use, and we're not using any pesticides that other farmers aren't using. So I asked them directly, give me a copy of the pesticide, list of pesticides, and they refused to do that. So I've asked them several times in writing for that information. They've refused to provide that information to me as a council member, trying to do my homework. So I went to the Department of Agriculture and I asked them. And after paying several $100s and waiting several months, I did get that information and found out that what they were telling me, what the seed companies were telling me, was not the truth. They are using experimental pesticides. They have experimental pesticide use permits, and they are using a wide range of what they call restricted use pesticides that no other farmers on Kauai are using. And so this is very troubling, and so I tried to take it to the next step and ask the Department of Agriculture, you know, I'd like a copy of the experimental use permits. And unfortunately, I've been unable to get that. That's public information. These are state permits. But the industry has been fighting essentially with the Department of Ag, saying this is confidential information, don't give it to Hooser. I've asked the Department of Ag for their inspection logs. They're required by law to inspect the use of these restricted use pesticides. And at first I was told that information was forthcoming, and I haven't been able to get it. I keep saying tomorrow, 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 and it's very troubling. Half the land being used by these companies on Kauai are state lands, public lands, crown lands. And in my opinion, and I think the law's opinion, they have a higher level of accountability when using state lands. And they're state lands, they're state permits, and the information still is not available to me.
And there was nothing that you could do through Freedom of Information other than to go to the Department of Ag?
Well, I have written, these have been formal requests using the Uniform Information Protection Act. And I haven't gone to the attorneys, I haven't filed suit yet for this information, but I might very well do so. And I have to add, these lands are the prime ag lands on Kauai. The industry will say, well, there's lots of ag land. Well, there's not lots of ag land that has water, or lots of ag land that have roads and infrastructure, and that are in these prime soils. They're getting top dollar for these lands, and they're taking them away from real farmers who want to grow food for
Okay,
Rhode
let's
Island.
stop with that point for a second, because you're talking about farmers who are using restricted pesticides. Now you just said real farmers, which is to say that you distinguish between the two based upon what they're growing. Scott, with what they're growing, are these real farmers, or are they farmers who are doing experimental crops for profit?
Well, they're clearly going for profit. It's a big company, and that's what they do. But I mean, when you look at real food, 95%, as we talked about last time, of what they're growing, GMOs, does not end up in food. It feeds animals. It goes to factory farms. It creates ethanol, that sort of thing. And I think 90% of it goes to that use, and 5% goes to high fructose corn syrup, as we talked about. So 5% gets fed to human beings. I think if we were to take these prime ag lands in Kauai and grow vegetables and beets and taro, we can feed a lot of people right here and create a lot of jobs here in Hawaii.
Which seems to be the disconnect that the two of you are talking about. When you look at, empirically, you look at what's being grown there and finding out where it's going, your contention is this is simply not winding up in our food chain in a way that we would like to have it wind up in our food, which is exactly where you come in when you say this is stuff that's winding up in food, and not only food, but in our resources, in our way of being, and in our own good health, the deleterious effects of all of this.
Yeah, when I was talking earlier, I was talking as a Hawaiian, and our ability to live here in Hawaii as Hawaiians, and we depend on our environment, because on the island of Molokai, we have two economies. One is the cash economy, and the other is a subsistence economy. The subsistence economy is critical to us because that's where we use all of our skills of harvesting in the ocean and harvesting on the land, planting our own food, and that's part of our culture. So now you got this industry that comes in there and has major, major impacts on our ability to continue our culture. When these acid rains and things go up into the mountains through evaporation and things and end up coming out on our reefs, because on our reefs is where the brackish water meets the reefs, and in the brackish water is where all the very basic food chain of the ocean starts, with diatoms and phytoplanktons and zooplanktons. And these are the ones that are affected. When you have these poisons coming out of these kipukas, it's affecting all of the life on the reef. So the reef is where our skills come to bear, and the reef is like the heart of our culture. So who is giving us baseline information? Who is protecting us from these dangerous kinds of impacts that are happening on our reefs? So we're not just talking about the mud that covers our reefs and the dust that covers our reefs and kills our reefs. We're talking about the very essence of the food chain on our reefs that's being impacted. We have no idea what's happening. And we cannot just sit there as Hawaiians and say, well, we'll give up our culture so we can have, these guys make
But you've
profits.
just overlaid a whole different strata to the conversation, because it's one thing to talk about who should have control over the information about what's going on with state lands or what's happening with restricted pesticides. It's another thing to say that there's a whole issue of culture that's being damaged. That's wrapping it into a different level besides health and law.
Right, and that's the reason I'm here today, because nobody is talking about that level, and it's a critical level because this is Hawaii. We're not growing corn in Iowa someplace. We're talking about we're in Hawaii. We're surrounded by an ocean. We got limited resources, and these people are huge. They're huge companies having major impacts on these resources, and that's the point I'm trying to make.
And when we tried to look at some of the science behind all of that, because to have the force of law, you better be able to come up with some good reasons, and that's going to come from the scientific community, not just people who are upset about what has been happening around their home or the fact that you can't control drift in this tiny little place. Getting that science, though, is really tough, and we began to touch on that the last time that we talked, Scott, because you're talking about so many different pesticides. Just looking at that one volume that Gary has there that shows some, not all, but just some of the pesticides being used. How do you check the toxicology of those and create some sort of matrix to know how much is too much or how they interact?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the burden of proof really is on us right now, and that is fundamentally kind of a strange way of going about it. So A, we don't have a ton of money to put behind these things to prove certain things, and B, toxicology and science in general works on a principle of isolation of variables. You isolate one variable and show what kind of toxicological effects it has. And if you can prove that it's toxic at a certain level, then the companies have to stay below that level. But when they're dousing us with 7 to 10 different types of chemicals, there's not a single laboratory result in the world that can emulate and kind of show what effects those will have. And then looking at it over years and years and years as we're being exposed to these chemicals on a day-to-day basis across our islands, there's no way to prove that in a laboratory. So we're left at a point where we have to kind of take their word that this chemical is safe and that chemical is safe and this chemical maybe is safe at that level, but put them all together in this toxic soup, who knows?
And you get a volume that looks kind of like that, plus a couple others behind it. But so how, Gary, do you take that and use it to your advantage as opposed to simply saying, it looks like there's nothing more that we can do?
Well, I think that it's up to the policymakers, local council, county policymakers, as well as state policymakers, to take responsibility for the health and safety of the people of our state and our environment. They need to take a proactive leadership role. This is one volume of labels from these restricted use pesticides. And I've read these labels, and these things are banned in much of Europe. There are other states that ban some of these chemicals. Hawaii could do the same thing. The state of Hawaii or the county of Kauai could use resources to evaluate the impacts locally, and that's what hasn't been done. A lot of people say, well, it's a federal responsibility, it's this or that. I believe it's our responsibility to look locally and say, what are the impacts? And it is expensive, but I believe the industry should pay for it. State and county governments should take the leadership role, but the industry should pay for it. They're using state lands. In this particular case on Kauai, found out doing my research that they hadn't paid their property taxes. These 4 companies had not paid property taxes since they started leasing the lands. And now the county of Kauai is filing back taxes for them. But take some of that money, some of those funds, permitting fees for whatever, and pay for the research and the impact analysis that needs to be done. For an EIS, for an environmental impact statement, it takes into consideration cultural impacts, economic impacts. Okay, the leasing of these lands not only take away prime ag lands from regular farmers, real farmers as I would say, but it drives the cost up because they're paying top dollar for the lands. So the cost of agricultural lands goes up for other farmers. There's lots of impacts. These impacts have not been studied. I think it's time we draw a line and say stop, and let's look at those impacts and regulate them appropriately.
In other arenas, we've also gotten stuck with the idea of, well, that EIS should have been done first before we did all of this. Is this just in part our failure to act in a logical way, or are we too sort of bedazzled by the potential profits that come along with some of this, particularly in a time where we were rather depressed?
You know, I think the economic impacts, the jobs, as Walter mentioned earlier, have been real strong influences, certainly in my community. But it's reached a point on Kauai now where there's a lawsuit involving over 200 local residents, suing Pioneer for impacts from the dust and the pesticide and the use that's going on. And that never would have happened 20 years ago. The plantation environment, they never questioned the boss, but people are concerned enough now, so we're at a tipping point in our state, I believe a tipping point in the nation, that it's time to move forward and again hold the companies accountable.
To hold a company accountable, all of that sounds like wonderful rhetoric, or that we're going to somehow force the state or county government to pay for some of this. But what's it really going to take before you think you're going to see some action both on your island or throughout the state? Scott, I mean, are we going to have a really horrible case that makes the point so undeniable that suddenly everybody's going to sit up and take notice?
Well, I think we're starting to see that across the state, that state residents are really pushing for some change. And it's a matter of critical mass, as Gary has mentioned earlier. If we get to a certain point where we educate enough people about what's going on, I think we'll start to see that tipping point come. I don't think we need to see a critical catastrophe. I think we're seeing a critical catastrophe. It's just over a long period of time. So I think that one of the big bottom lines is that they will argue that they're bringing so much money to the state and so many jobs to the state. But what they're pulling away from the state is our ability to feed ourselves, our ability to employ ourselves, our ability to subsistence agriculture, and as Walter was talking about, some of the impacts to our culture. And they're off-putting a lot of their costs onto us for healthcare, honeybee collapse, so pollination rates go down. There's so many what we call in economics externalities of the cost of doing business, of the business of GMOs, that get externalized onto the people of Hawaii. Not the least of which is that once we're now shipping all of their product to the mainland, we're now importing actual food from the mainland as opposed to just creating that food here and feeding ourselves. What does that do? It drives the cost of, every time you go to the grocery store, it drives the cost quite a bit up.
So it seems your argument is that we need to do a real cost-benefit analysis with some of these figures that Monsanto is putting out to the public.
Absolutely. If you look at the externalities, it's an absolute no-brainer. There is no argument they can make to come back from that says, oh no, economically this is actually benefiting the state.
So talk some real numbers behind all of that.
That's a great question. I mean, digging into some detail on that would take quite a bit of research, and that's obviously something that we haven't had an economic study that has done that here in the state. But in California, they're looking at the almond harvest, and when the honeybee collapse happened this year, they're looking at, I mean, it's an absurd amount of money, a lot of money lost just in pollination. When you look at epidemiological kind of cases, when you have people getting sick, how much is that costing us here in the state? Looking at the cost of food, you don't, as Walter said, you don't necessarily need science to prove that the cost of food here in Hawaii has gone up quite a bit, and that it's a major burden, especially on poorer people. When you look at the imported food that is coming back, it's all processed, it's all junk, it's all full of high fructose corn syrup. And so as a result, our own public health has suffered. And so of course now we're subsidizing diabetes and all these other public health epidemics. So where do you even begin? But they're all externalized costs.
But that's the question. Don't we have to begin somewhere? Don't we have to begin to quantify this? And how do we do it in a meaningful way that moves the discussion forward, as opposed to continuing to have the same discussions that we've had over and over again, where people are angry and they feel they've been taken advantage of and they feel threatened, and at a very basic level?
I've done some quantification, okay? And I have 22 restricted use pesticides that the labels say keep away from human beings. These kill bees, keep out of the water, keep out of the environment. 22 different restricted use pesticides. And I have the information that shows tons of it, literally tons of it. 3.5 tons are put on the land, near the water, near people's homes on Kauai year after year. Okay, so that's enough for me. And I think if you want to quantify further, look at the people. And this is a national movement. People are concerned. The totality of the information that the wheat farm in Oregon that is going to wreck millions and millions of dollars to the wheat industry there, possibly already is doing that. There's no question that pollen drift runs a real risk of contaminating the crops. One of the potential industries on Kauai and throughout the state is organic agriculture. That's a high-value niche market. The more and more of the world wants this. They're willing to pay top dollar for it. If your crop is contaminated by GMOs, you're wiped out. You're gone. The costs are being pushed forward to take care of this. The contamination of the soil, state public soil, the water. We had 30,000 sea urchins die off the coast of Kauai a couple of years ago, immediately adjacent to these fields. Was it caused by the chemicals? Who knows? But we have our reefs are being depleted. The visitor industry now is being impacted as more and more people, they don't want to be around the clouds of pesticide dust.
We're coming down to the very last couple of minutes that we have with each other, and I want to ask you, Walter, first of all, and then the two of you, what's the bottom line that you want people to do at this point, given the fact that perhaps all this information is not as quantified as you would like it, although Gary has done his bit and has released his part? Well, what do people need to do right now?
Well, we've been working on this for the whole past year, and a couple of years, in fact. So we started off with like 5-6 guys. Now we have thousands of people marching. So something has happened within a very short period of time here in Hawaii. And that is, people are beginning to get fed up with a lot of different things. And this GMO stuff is becoming like a lightning rod for a lot of these things. People are fed up that the government is being controlled by corporations like Monsanto and other big corporations, and that our public lands are now being turned over to these corporations so that the state can make money. and that our natural resources are being turned over to these guys. And we're fed up as Hawaiians when they start dismantling all of the protections that are set up to help us protect our culture and our way of life. So all of these things are combining and coming into a head. And I think by next year, we're going to have labeling in the state of Hawaii because people are pretty much fed up with what's happening in our government. And I think that's a really big issue. And we've been working for a whole year. We're going to work for the next year. And we're going to make sure that what's going to happen is that we're going to get people to actually do things and get involved and all of those things that are necessary to fight these huge corporations.
Gary, Scott, both of you chime in just very quickly because we're running a little bit short of time. He's saying we're at a point of critical mass because people are just fed up, and this now is becoming the issue that's going to be defining perhaps others that come after it.
I would tend to agree. I think one of the things you have to look at is that, again, we can get lost in the weeds. Some of these studies take years and years and years to prove, but fundamentally I think we know that these companies are not necessarily good for Hawaii. Companies don't come here to bring money or be altruistic to Hawaii. They come here to make money. And if they can do that, the best way for them to do that is to put their costs off on us and then allow them to make more money.
And Gary? I think the critical mass, the public is going to demand from policymakers, state, county, and federal, to do something. To me, I wrote something, I like to blog, I wrote something called It's Not About Eating the Corn, okay? For me, it's not about the science, it's about the people that own the science, the people that profit from the science. And it's about the impacts on our local community here in Hawaii and on Kauai.
And they have a much bigger marketing budget than we do. So they're going to confound the truth at every turn.
Bottom line, it's going to be driven from the bottom up, and you believe that that's where it's coming from.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Beth.
Good chance to talk again. Look forward to more. Thanks to our panelists, Walter Ritty, Scott Cooney, and Gary Hooser, for providing their points of view on the downside of GMOs. Be sure to visit olelo.org/GMO to watch it all again on demand, where you can see both pro and anti-GMO conversations. And be sure to send in your questions for our live discussions. We hope you found tonight's program helpful in making informed decisions and staying engaged with the community. I'm Beth Ann Kozlovich for GMO Week. On behalf of Olelo Community Media, thanks for tuning in.